Hello and welcome to the latest podcast from the Blood Red channel with myself, Matt Addison. The Under-21 European Championships begin again on Monday. It's the knockout stages now, with the groups having been played in the last international break. And we're going to have a look through all of the big contenders, assessing which players you should be watching out for and which ones could be of interest to Michael Edwards and Liverpool as possible transfer targets. Alongside me to do just that is Leeds Live's Leeds United reporter Joe Donnohue, who's been on the podcast a couple of times in the past. Joe, you also write for Scouted Football, a website that looks into giving people the lowdown really on the next generation of talent coming through. And I suppose then the Under-21 Euros must be an ideal opportunity for yourself to do a bit of scouting.
Yeah, it's kind of our bread and butter, essentially. Everybody's getting excited about the Euros this summer, but it's the Under-21 Euros that I've kind of been keeping an eye on as well, because there was the group stage which took place at the end of March, and then the knockout round is now taking place in the next week or so. So it's a good opportunity to sort of to get the jump on quite a few players who obviously will be playing international football for their countries in the years to come, and potentially some in the months to come, as there'll be some crossover from the squads who were at the Under-21 Euros in the group stage, who'll now be making the senior squads at this summer's Euros.
Yeah, as I say, we're going to go through pretty much all of the teams. We're going to pick out a few different players from each of them. I'm sure Liverpool fans will want us to discuss Ibrahima Konate. We'll come to him very shortly. Obviously, we expect he'll be playing for France. Obviously, injuries might get in the way of that. But other than that, you'd expect him to be involved. But as you say, we're into the knockout stages. We're up to the quarterfinals now. Croatia taking on Spain, Portugal versus Italy, Denmark against Germany, and Holland against France. England obviously got knocked out in the group stages. We'll get to that very shortly. But just quickly, in terms of the 8 teams remaining, would you say France are probably the favourites at this stage?
I think they probably are just edging it, yeah, in terms of the depth that they have in their squad. I think you said in your notes that this squad could challenge for the European Championships, proper, and not the Under-21s version. And I think that's a fair assessment. Really, it's absolutely stacked with talent, stacked with experience as well. Lots of Liga experience in there among those players, so it's no surprise to see them get through the group. But I'd say Portugal are in with a good shout as well. They've equally got a very strong squad. They've had a few who've moved up to the senior squad. I think Pedro Gonçalves, who's having a very good season, and with Sporting in Portugal, I think he's been called up to the senior squad, so he won't be in there. But nevertheless, they've still got a fantastic crop of players. And I suppose on the England discussion, it kind of comes down to, France and Portugal obviously got through, but England didn't. And I'd say England's squad was of a similar sort of ilk to those two teams. So it's there was a post-mortem afterwards, I think, of why that group stage campaign was unsuccessful.
Yeah, let's have a little chat now before we get into the teams who are still in it. Let's have a chat about England. They obviously came bottom of their group. They were in there with Portugal and Croatia. Switzerland finished above them as well. I mean, as you say, when you've got that many players in that team, that you'd expect them to probably challenge, certainly to get through the group, to not just not get through, but to not even finish third. I mean, they were bottom of that group. Why do you think that happened? How has that happened with this team?
I think it's very easy to point fingers, but there's been sort of an institutional issue with the England Under-21 setup for quite a little while now. And while I don't think that Adi Boothroyd's necessarily a bad manager, I just think that there was perhaps better options for the job to sort of get the best out of what has been a very, very talented crop of players. There was a feeling that when England went forward, obviously they had this plethora of attacking options, but it kind of felt as though there wasn't a cohesive plan. There were players running down blind alleys. It just wasn't very joined up. And in the qualifying campaigns, where England were sort of relying on getting loads and loads of chances, having loads of the ball, and then Eddie Nketiah poking 1 or 2 in, because that's exactly what he's good at. They weren't getting those opportunities in the actual tournament proper. So it changed, I think, with the final game against Croatia, which England obviously gave a better account of themselves. But ultimately, the damage was done in the first 2 games in the defeats to Switzerland and Portugal. And then Domagoj Bradarić, I think it was, scored a great goal in the final minutes of that last game against Croatia, and that condemned England to elimination.
Yeah, in terms of Liverpool players in the England squad, I mean, there was only Curtis Jones involved. Obviously, Ryan Brewster was there as well, who's one that Liverpool fans will be familiar with. But he only started once, Curtis Jones. I think that was the third and final game. That sort of seems a little bit strange to me. Would you agree that maybe he should have played, given sort of his performances for Liverpool this season? You look at one or two of the players in that squad, they're probably not, on paper at least, better suited than him.
Yeah, I think that's a completely fair assessment. I think Curtis Jones is one of the most talented players, naturally talented players in that squad. It was evident when he and Ebereeze, obviously at Crystal Palace, when they both started in the in the final game, that there was more impetus, there was more oomph from midfield. And this isn't a slight on players like Ollie Skipp, because I think he's a fantastic defensive midfielder. But there seemed to be a lot of the setup against Switzerland, the setup against Portugal was rather reserved, and I think a player like Curtis Jones starting in one of those games, a lot of the time these under-21 tournaments, they do rely on that ability from an immensely talented player to just unlock the game, and Curtis Jones, I think, is one of those players, and it was a little bit puzzling to see why he wasn't trusted in the middle, but just to have a real go at things. So yeah, it was. I think Curtis Jones can probably feel a little bit sort of aggrieved that he didn't play a more influential part in that campaign.
Yeah, definitely. Let's go on to some of the teams who are still in the tournament. Then we'll start with France, who, as we said before, I think could probably challenge in the senior Euros, such as the depth in their squad. They've got so many good players that we could go through. But I think it makes sense to start with Ibrahima Konate. Obviously, we expect, possibly even by the time that people are listening to this podcast, that a €40 million move to Liverpool could have been confirmed and completed. It's pretty much over the line as we're speaking now. But in terms of him, how excited do you think Liverpool fans should be? To me, he just seems like an absolutely perfect player for what Liverpool need.
Well, I mean, he's a centre half for starters, and for Liverpool fans over the past 9 months or so, that's somebody who can function in that position is a natural and has a wealth of experience at the top level of German football. I think rightly so. Liverpool supporters should be excited. I think there's always been lots made about Dayot Upamecano, who's also at Red Bull Leipzig, RB Leipzig, sorry, alongside Ibrahima Konate, and there's obviously Liverpool saw what Ozan Kabak had to offer. He was at Schalke, obviously, and will probably be returning there. With Konate, I've always been quite high on him. It's just that I think the past few seasons I haven't seen a lot of him, purely because he's had a few issues with injuries and whatnot, and obviously that's not what Liverpool fans want to hear. But I think as a talented player, he's somebody who in future you can see representing France at senior level. And while the 21 setup is an embarrassment of riches, it goes to show that these high profile players are not viewing I'm above the 21s, that sort of thing. So I think it'll be good to see him in the knockout rounds. It won't be easy because the Netherlands they've got their own players for France to worry about. But in terms of what Liverpool are getting, I think he's a good ball carrier, he's a good ball progressor, and just his defensive fundamentals are there. I think sometimes people have seen maybe a few nicks to Upamecano's game. And sort of in Champions League fixtures, and you've kind of gone, is the hype necessary? Whereas with Konate, I think there'll probably be fewer 9 out of 10 performances, but there'll also be fewer 4 out of 10 performances, and then I think you might get with Upamecano. So I think what I'd compare it to is when Arsenal went for William Saliba at Nice at Saint Etienne, and Leicester ended up going for Wesley Fofana. I think there's probably, while other teams may go for Upamecano and the more, fashionable signing, then I think Liverpool have gone with, and 35 million as well is what we're talking. I think that's quite a shrewd deal for a defender who could, for 6-7 years be at the top of his game.
I think in terms of the injuries, it's important to point out as well, it's been sort of long-term injuries. They've been impact injuries. They've been sort of 6-7 months injured rather than lots of little injuries, which we've seen with Joel Matip. It's a case of every other game he's got some small knock that means he can't play. It's not quite the same in terms of those injuries. And I'm sure Liverpool will have done their research in terms of that. I'm sure the medical was extremely thorough to try and work out if there was, any sort of long-term worries for them. But I suppose it just goes back to Liverpool doing things slightly differently, doesn't it? I suppose with one or two other of the players that we're going to talk through on this list as well, it's possible that Liverpool could move for these players because, as you say, they've not gone for the obvious one at Leipzig. They've gone for one that probably a lot of people weren't talking about, possibly because he's not played much, but probably also because he's not quite got the hype of Upamecano, who was alongside him.
Yeah, I think with these under-21 tournaments, the devil's in the detail. And I think a lot of the time you can find really good deals, not even in the Frances and the Spains and the Italys, but in sort of the Denmarks. And Denmark are my sort of dark horse for this tournament. They beat France in the group stage back in March. They were really, really efficient, really effective. They really nullified, all the attacking talent that France have. And then they took their opportunity really well. But yeah, for example, the Denmarks in this tournament, even Croatia, there'll be players in there who teams will perhaps might overlook, but realistically would be a better fit than somebody who's more fashionable, more expensive. But yeah, I think it's when you see that clubs going, especially big clubs, going down a very well trodden path, they're all going after the same player, but the teams have different styles of play. You think, well, why is that the case? Surely there is a player who's maybe less high profile, but is better suited to the way that you want to play football. So, I mean, usually with Liverpool, you kind of trust the signings that they're going to make because obviously Michael Edwards knows the alignment between Jurgen Klopp, between his coaching staff, between the recruitment staff. It appears very joined up, whereas you don't get that at every club. So you can imagine that obviously it's a well thought out sort of move. With the future in mind, essentially, not as a quick fix, I think, which might be the easy assumption to jump to.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I mean, in terms of Upamecano, he will be at the Under-21 Euros with Konate. Jules Koundé was another one who was one that possibly Liverpool did look at. Certainly speculation around him, very, very highly rated. Manchester City were after him 12 months ago. He's not in the Under-21 Euros because he's stepped up to the seniors. So we'll move on to the midfield as well. I think Eduardo Camavinga, we've done a whole podcast on him a few weeks ago. Really, really exciting player. Somebody who I'd certainly like Liverpool to look at in terms of possibly replacing Gini Wijnaldum in a slightly different type of player, but certainly considerably younger, still very experienced. And Houssem Aouar as well is always one that is sort of linked with Arsenal, Liverpool, Manchester City. In Camavinga and Aouar, you've got two really talented players there.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, for an under-21 tournament, I've used the term embarrassment of riches before, but it's kind of, I'm tempted to go with it again for the midfield because, the options that France have in the middle. Matteo Guendouzi, who's the captain, he's missing out of the knockout stage because I think he's injured. But even players like that, perhaps the less sexy ones, the less the names which are they're not immediately sort of making your eyes light up. They're very, very efficient operators, and they've got a great wealth of options there. With Houssem Aouar, it's interesting that he's named in there because he's somebody who's been sort of in and around the senior setup for a while, but again, he's another one where the 21s is probably at this moment in time the best chance he's going to get of playing international football because of the options that Didier Deschamps has at the top level. So I think it'll be interesting to see because there were games in the group stage, particularly that Denmark game, where France, particularly Camavinga, in fact, in that Denmark game, Nicolas Narty, who's the Danish defensive midfielder, he was on loan at SV Sandhausen in the Zweite Bundesliga, so the German equivalent of the Championship this season from Stuttgart, and he had a really excellent game. He really did a number on Camavinga from the first minute. So it'll be interesting to see how he does if he continues in that midfield because Sylvain Ripoll, who's the France Under-21 coach, he did mix it up after that Denmark defeat in midfield and changed the elements in his midfield equation, for want of a better phrase, because it didn't work against Denmark, but it did work against Russia and against Iceland. So it'll be interesting to see. I think the tactical battle against the Netherlands will be quite good because there'll be some good players on either side.
And just to finish off with France, then we've done defence, we've done midfield. We should probably do the attack as well. Odsonne Edouard at Celtic is another one that's been linked with Liverpool at times. linked with Arsenal as well. I think around sort of 30 million that he would be sort of valued at. But again, it's another good player for a lot of countries. He'd be in the senior side.
Yeah, and again, there's players like Moussa Dembele, who's obviously at Lyon, at Atletico Madrid now, isn't he? Who was in and around milling around the under-21 setup for a lot longer than a lot of people thought. I think it's a very similar case with Odsonne Edouard. Karim Benzema coming back into the senior squad is probably the worst bit of news that he probably got, but he's a fantastic player at linking play. I think a lot of people misconstrue him as perhaps just being a player who can use, is very much a traditional number 9, but he's a lot more than that. He can play in the channels. He loves coming off the left hand side and then into the center of the pitch. But for me, the attacker that I'd really be keeping an eye out for is Amine Gouiri, who's been at Nice this season. He typically plays as sort of a left forward. He's not quite a winger. He's not quite a centre forward, not at senior football anyway, although he has extensive experience of that at youth football. But he's a very, 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 very good operator in these spaces. And he's somebody who had a very good season with Nice in a very tepid Nice team. I think they finished mid-table, but I think he got around 12 goals and about 7 assists, or the other way around. I know he had sort of roughly around 15 to 20 goal involvements, and this was coming off the back of some serious injuries that he'd had, and he's one who I think if he can get the link up with Odsonne Edouard, then that is something which you have to be looking at and thinking, well, if they strike gold with this, then France have to be in with a shout, I think.
If they are going to be in for a shout, they're going to have to come up against the Netherlands. And we've mentioned them a couple of times. We might as well move on to them next. I mean, in terms of the names, again, in that team, you look at some of those players. And again, you could say it for France. You could probably say it for the Netherlands. There's players in there that you just wouldn't expect to be playing for the under-21s. You'd expect certainly Sven Botman and Per Schuurs at the back, particularly with Van Dijk missing out for the seniors. You might have expected one or two of those players to step up and replace him maybe.
Yeah, I mean, Sven Botman, obviously Liverpool fans will know a lot about him due to the links that have sort of arisen since his time at Ajax, but on loan at Heerenveen, and then with Lille this season. Schuurs, though, is one who was, he was a picture of consistency throughout the group stage. Everything you'd come to expect from an AFC Ajax centre back. Confident on the ball, had good range, good recovery speed. His anticipation was good. He was the right-sided of the centre-back pairing in the Netherlands group matches, and he was very good with the ball, very good in terms of his distribution, but also in terms of reading the danger well. Even in games against Romania and Hungary in that group stage where the Netherlands kind of dominated the ball and the centre-halves were expected to push up and maybe try and find those more searching passes. He never seemed rushed. He didn't sort of try and fire passes into areas which were perhaps a little bit inefficient. Schuurs was very assured at the back. He was, whenever the moves broke down, his Dutch teammates, they could turn and they knew he'd be there. He'd be offering as an option, if they couldn't get down the sides. So I think he's a very, very cool operator. Very, very assured in his defensive work, and I think France will have their work cut out because he's a developing sort of top level defender. I think he'll be one who's definitely earmarked for the Dutch setup in future.
In midfield, Toon Koopmeiners, and hopefully I've pronounced that correctly. He's one that's been linked with Liverpool as well. Lots of goals this season. Obviously, Liverpool looking for a Wijnaldum replacement. Kind of a similar sort of age, I think, to when Wijnaldum moved to England. Obviously, Wijnaldum was a goal-scoring midfielder back then as well. So there are some similarities. He's moved up to the senior squad for the Euro, so he won't be playing in the knockout stages of this competition. But I just wanted to ask you about him as well. I mean, 17 goals, 7 assists this season from midfield. Playing for AZ Alkmaar as well, which is a team which is very much data-driven. All of the sort of similarities to Liverpool, obviously, not as big a club or with as much money to spend and that sort of thing. But there are sort of similarities that you can draw there. He looks like a really interesting player to me as well.
Yeah, I mean, Koopmeiners is a lot. The big caveat is that a lot of his goals do come from the penalty spot, but he's a very good penalty taker. So I mean, you don't want to take that away from anybody if they're good at something. But he is, he's more of a sort of a 6/8. I think he what he'll do, especially with the Netherlands, the 21s, he'd be the next port of call. If very similar to how Persia's would be sort of when players would turn around and they need an out ball but backwards, Persia's would be there. Whenever the attackers would need that, then Koopmeiners would be there. He'd support by pushing into sort of the lateral spaces, very similar to how Jordan Henderson does actually, and dropping into sort of the fullback role, the fullback position when the fullbacks push on. And he was very adept at that. I thought, there were times when you kind of wanted a little bit more. You were left sort of desiring a little bit more from him. But when it came to sort of the switching passes and the just picking locks, kind of finding just that little ball in between lines into the feet of somebody like Cody Gakpo or Noah Long, he was able to do it. And I mean, there's been a lot of interest in him. I think a few Italian clubs are interested in Koopmeiners. I've seen Bayern Munich's name, even Leeds have been linked, but I think it's very tentative on that side of things. He's definitely a player who will not be staying at AZ Alkmaar forever. He will move on at some point. Whether that's to be a Wijnaldum replacement, I'm not entirely sold on, but he's certainly a player that could play Champions League football at a maybe not this coming year, but perhaps in future, depending on what his next move is from AZ.
Yeah, he's certainly at the right age. I think he's maybe 23, just about. So yeah, certainly ready, I think, for the next step in his career. But yeah, is there anybody else in that Holland squad that sort of stands out to you that we've not spoken about there? I mean, there's a few sort of household names almost in terms of the attackers that people will know. But is there anybody maybe slightly more left field that you've got your eye on?
Well, there's a goalkeeper, Kjell Scherpen, who has been linked with a move. I think he's been heavily linked with a move to Brighton this summer. It looks like he'll complete a £5 million deal there, and he was quite good in the group stage as well, which kind of caught me a little bit by surprise because I hadn't really seen an awful lot of him at Ajax. But he was very, very good with his distribution, very, very secure, and as well, he made important saves at big moments, which I think is one of the best things you can have in a goalkeeper at a major tournament. We remember sort of Guillermo Ochoa at the 2014 World Cup, Keylor Navas, those performances which essentially in a few matches defined a career, got themselves a major move. He was in terms of sort of like ball progression, he was quite good in terms of just clipping out to the wide areas to the fullbacks. But I mean, I think your goalkeeping fundamentals, he was pretty solid. Now that I've said that, he'll go and probably have a howler against the French. But yeah, he's one sort of if Brighton were looking to sort of give Robert Sanchez a bit of competition next season, then I can see why they did go and make that move.
Yeah, certainly Brighton, another club that look at data and all of that sort of thing. I'm sure they'll be taking a keen eye at this tournament. We're going to go through Germany, Spain, Portugal and Italy before we finish. I think we'll start with Germany. There's, again, a couple of players in there that people will know. Youssoufa Moukoko at 16. I mean, he's one that we've kind of heard about since he was about 13. I mean, he's one of those that's really come through and made a name for himself. Obviously, at Borussia Dortmund, he's possibly one that you might expect in this tournament to take another step forward, perhaps?
Potentially. I think if Lucas and Mecha is still in the squad, I think he'll probably start ahead of Moukoko in that central striking role for Germany, because he did well enough in the group stage. David Raum is another one at left back, who's essentially a left wing back. He signs for Hoffenheim on a free transfer this summer from Greuther Fürth. He's a fantastic crosser of the ball, gets loads of assists there. But with Moukoko, he's something like 130 goals in 80 games for Dortmund's under-19 side and under-17 sides. Some ridiculous record, and obviously showed his ability when he moved up to the first team. I'm always quite cautious to not overhype players, especially when they're of such a young age. But I think the fact that he's been named in an under-21 squad kind of is a reflection of how highly he's rated. I don't expect him to get a great deal of time on the pitch, especially given how tournament football can be. But yeah, I think it's a reflection of just how much potential he does have, that he's already been sort of named around these squads.
Yeah, certainly with goal scoring numbers like that, it's hard, I think, for these players not to get hyped up. I know Charlie McNeil is one at Manchester United now, who again has got ridiculous numbers at youth level. I'm sure we're going to hear a lot about him, and Moukoko is very, very similar. I mean, there's a couple more players I wanted to pick out as well. Riedler Baku at Wolfsburg is one. Obviously, they had a brilliant season as a collective. They finished fourth. Oliver Glasner taking them there. He's now gone to Eintracht Frankfurt. I mean, that looks like a team that could possibly be picked apart, and Baku possibly one of the standouts in that team as well.
Yeah, he's an interesting one because he's quite a versatile player. Is Baku? He's played as a right back. He's played as a right midfielder. He's played as a right winger. He kind of played as a hybrid of the latter too in the Germany's group stage at the Under-21 Euros back in March. But he's good at popping up and getting a few goals. You know that he's going to be able to work back and track because he's got that defensive experience in his armory. But he's I like his work rate. I think he's a player that is in this Germany team, which isn't by any means the strongest Germany under-21 group that there has been for a long time. I think there have been stronger ones when they made the final in 2019. But he's one of the first names on this team sheet, and I think he got 2 or 3 goals in the group stage. So wouldn't be surprised to see him play a major role if Germany ended up sort of getting past Denmark in the next round. But that's a different task altogether because Denmark already beaten France. So yeah, I've already said they're my dark horses. I've kind of got a little bit of hope pinned on them that they might surprise Baku in Germany.
Yes, certainly one to watch out for. I'll try and catch as many of these games. They're all, I think, on Sky Sports in the UK for anybody listening and wanting to view these matches. And Spain is another team that I want to keep an eye on, as well as, again, a few players in there that people will know. Martin Zubimendi, though, a Real Sociedad player, has come through and obviously worked with Xabi Alonso with their B team. Stepped up now, I think, to their senior team, and is another one to watch out for. I think there's a few players at Sociedad that I would be keeping an eye on, but he is certainly one of those.
Yeah, I think the message with Zubimendi is just he's a complete La Real player. He's coming through the youth academy there where they don't have. I think it's something like they don't have that their youngest team is under 13s or something. They kind of pride themselves on very much enjoying football before it gets to that stage where it has to be too serious or uber. Whatever another word for serious is, I've gone blank, unfortunately. But with Zubimendi, he's very secure. He's very good on the ball, as you'd expect from working under somebody like Xabi Alonso. Playing along somebody like Mikel Merino, who was unfortunate to miss out on the senior Spain squad for the Euros this summer. And I think he's just a very classy player, especially for an under-21 tournament. He's just a very enjoyable player to watch. If he's very similar to players where you say if you watch the game you miss Zubimendi, but if you watch Zubimendi you see the entirety of the game. Everything will sort of funnel through him. His security at the base of the midfield will allow players like Gonzalo Villar to maybe support the attacks a little bit more, and I think that's necessary for Spain because I think apart from Javi Puado and Abel Ruiz is in this squad as well, but he's not. I've always had reservations about his top level ability. Javi Puado scored a few goals in the group stage for Spain, but they definitely do need help from midfield. So having that security, knowing that the number 8s can push on because they've got Zubimendi in tow behind will definitely be useful.
Brahim Diaz as well is one that I wanted to pick out. He was at Manchester City as a younger player, now AC Milan. Is he one of those that City might look back and regret? There's been maybe 1 or 2, particularly wingers, when you think of Jadon Sancho as well. I mean, it's very difficult to get into the Manchester City team, obviously, at senior level. That's why he moved on, but he is still a very, very good player.
Yeah, he's a very talented player. I think that's the key message with Diaz. I think he left Man City because he wanted first team football, very much similar to Jadon Sancho, and he got that opportunity elsewhere. He's been sort of in and about the team at AC Milan, and there's, truth be told, I haven't seen an awful lot. I think when the last time I did see him, it was kind of a very fleeting sort of substitute appearances, and it was like, well, would you have had more time on the pitch at Man City or here, Real Madrid? That sort of thing. It's an unquestionable. It's a difficult question, but I think if he gets the time on the pitch, especially in the knockouts, I think the tie against Croatia is definitely one which you can unleash a player like that, and you can say, go and play with a bit of freedom. Go and show that you've got that game changing ability that you perhaps wouldn't get the opportunity to show at senior level, but you can at under 21 because you've got a lot of domestic based players from Croatia in that squad. So perhaps not playing at the highest level regularly, that maybe a player who's played in Serie A, La Liga can exploit. Brahim Diaz is going to be at the top of that list in terms of the players who are capable of doing something like that. But it's not about one individual. It's about the whole team. I think it'll be an interesting game. I'd still peg the Spanish to be favourites, though.
Yeah, Spain always a team to watch at the Under-21 Euros. They always seem to have a lot of players who then step up. I think the first ever Under-21 Euros that I watched was the one that Thiago Alcantara was top scorer, I think, in that. Certainly was player of the tournament, played as a number 10 in that, and obviously he's a very different player now. But yeah, I mean, is there anybody else that you'd pick out from that Spanish squad that you might sort of look to in the future, maybe to step up?
I think Juan Miranda at left back. He's quite a good operator on that left hand side, but also Marc Cucurella, who is similar to Baku in a sense that he can play as a left winger and a left midfielder and a left back. He's been at Getafe for the past few seasons. And he's been working under Jose Bordalas, a very specific, very aggressive role. He's high pressing, but he's also creative. And I do like Cucurella. He's unmistakable because he's got really long, curly, dark hair. Very, very, very distinguishable on the pitch. But I think him and Miranda on that left hand side, they are both interesting players. Miranda's he's erratic's probably the wrong word to describe Cucurella when he's going forward, but Miranda's less erratic. He's a lot more. I feel like he's a better dribbler coming inside, whereas Cucurella might be better going outside. But yeah, those two on that left side, if they're both sort of on the same wavelength, then there's trouble afoot for the opposition.
Yeah, nice little balance there. One inside, one outside. Yeah. might work quite nicely there. Let's move on to Portugal then. We've already mentioned him. Pedro Gonçalves. Hopefully I pronounced that again correctly. One of those that I always read and wonder if I've said it correctly in my head or not. But he is, again, one of those linked to be rumoured to be of interest to Liverpool. He's not in the Under-21 squad because he's stepped up, and that's absolutely deserved after a brilliant season for him.
Yeah, I think he's got something around the 20 goal mark for Sporting this season, and they won their first Liga NOS, Primera Liga title for around 20 years, I think it is. I think the last time they won it was 2001, 2002. So it's no surprise that he's made the step up and is sort of making up the forwards in Fernando Santos's senior Portugal squad. But I think if the thing with everybody struggles with his name. I struggle. So I always go with his nickname Pote instead, Pote, which he wears on the back of his shirt. Because I remember the first time watching him, I was like, I swear I saw Pedro Gonçalves on the team sheet. And I was like, by sort of deducing that he such and such was this one, that one, that Pote was his name. But he's the thing that I think with him is, I wonder where he'd play, because he kind of plays at Liverpool. That is, I think he kind of plays in between that. Not quite a striker, not quite a false nine, but also not quite a traditional number 10 attacking midfielder. He's not somebody who's going to sort of sit on the shoulder of the last man. And I do think, well, could he play a Firmino type role? It's not my. I think his pressing might have to be upped a little bit if that was the case, but. In terms of, you can't argue with his goals return. He's clearly doing something right. I haven't done any sort of background into what that is, but I think there's definitely scope to say that, he's a player who deserves to be in a senior international setup, and players like that tend to attract interest from the top clubs, and obviously Liverpool's one of them.
There's been lots of sort of comparisons between him and Bruno Fernandes. Do you think there's anything actually in that? Or do you think it's just they play in a similar position? They're both Portuguese, they both play for Sporting, and they both score loads of goals?
I think you've probably hit the nail on the head there. I think obviously they play in a similar position, obviously score a lot of goals. They're obviously very influential on their respective sides, but I think it's very easy to make the next Bruno Fernandes assumption when there are definitely differences to their games.
In terms of the other players who are in the Portuguese squad, I mean, Rafa, Leao and Vitinha as well. Vitinha was one that maybe I expected a little bit more. He was on loan from Porto at Wolves this season, obviously. Not the only Portuguese link at Wolves, far from it. But I think he only played 19 times in the Premier League. Most of that was off the bench, maybe for 5 or 10 minutes at the end. He didn't quite step up, but I think we saw probably just enough to see that there is a player there. Maybe he didn't quite fit the physicality of the Premier League, but certainly there's a couple of good players in that Portugal squad, and he's one of them.
Yeah, Vitinha was truth be told, the group stage of the Under-21 Euros was a tournament that was lacking in overall quality, I think. But in terms of midfielders who can sort of dictate the tempo, it wasn't. It was kind of well stocked in that sense. And Vitinha was kind of one of the reasons for that. He was, as far as patience and positioning goes in the middle, Vitinha I don't think was matched during those 3 group games. There was a number of occasions where he tried to assist your teammates with a floated ball over the top or deep crosses and that sort of thing. And it wasn't until the third match day that he pulled it off. But it was the breakdown of a corner. He gets the ball on sort of the edge of the area and then whips one in for Diogo Queiroz, whose heads in at the far post, and it was nothing less than he deserved. They dominated the ball. They had to break teams down, especially in that first game against Croatia. They had to break them down, and Vitinha's ability was key to that because he kept the moves ticking over. He didn't hold on to the ball for unnecessarily long periods, but he waited for the opportune moment to really pick out the pass, and I think that shows maturity. And I hope that he has a bigger role at Wolves next season because clearly the Portuguese infrastructure is there. That he's not going to feel like a fish out of water, but the option, I'd say he's a very, very adept number 8 who, especially at under-21 level at this Euros, and if Portugal do go all the way, then he will be a big part of that. No less just because of the group stage, but because I think he'll play a major role in the knockouts as well.
Let's move on to the final team that we're going to pick out then. I know we've not gone through Croatia or Denmark, your dark horses, but we will go through Italy. I think it's more likely that the 6 teams that we've picked out would be of interest to Liverpool, certainly. So in terms of Italy, Sandro Tonali is one that has always been linked with Liverpool. Didn't have the best group stages by all accounts. He's been left out this time. Has he been left out because he didn't have a good start to the tournament? Is that the reason, or is he going to be the senior squad for Italy?
I need to check the senior squads, the squad list for certainty. But I remember watching the first game that Italy played at the Under-21 Euros this year, and Tonali was obviously in the game, but he didn't stroll through it like he was the player that was a 40 million addition at AC Milan. He was very much an equal part of that game. You wouldn't have picked him out and said, right, he's your 40 million man right there. And then he got sent off towards the end, and it was a really needless sending off. It was a completely unnecessary thing to do in the corner of the pitch. Italy were already, I think they were drawn at that point. But he definitely just didn't need to do it. He was then obviously suspended for the next 2 group games, and I think as a result, if it was a straight red, and you might have to correct me on that, then he's obviously going to be out of the quarterfinals. So picking him probably wouldn't have made much sense. I think he just needs to get back to regular football essentially, and there are options in this Italy team so that they can survive without him, and they can set up Paolo Nicolato, who's the under-21 coach. He can set them up in a way which doesn't rely on having that deep lying distributing midfielder, which I think sometimes is maybe not the best use of resources in this Italy team, given the players in their attack like Gianluca Scamacca and players like that.
Yeah, I was going to pick him out as well, obviously, at Genoa. Scamacca had a really good season by all accounts. I can't, to be honest, say that I've seen him play before, but he's one of those names that you're starting to hear about. I think we always get it with these under-21 Euros. There's always 1 or 2 players that sort of start to get whispers of they're having good seasons, they could have a good tournament, and then he could just be one of those that kicks on. Do you think he's one to pick out, and would there be anybody else in that attack that you think is worth watching as well?
Yeah, the attack. I mean, Scamacca for starters he's an incredibly imposing striker, but he's very mobile. For great touch for a big lad sort of thing. He's around 6'3", very strong. Looks very striking on the pitch. You can't miss him. And he's a very, very good finisher. There was a goal that he scored for Genoa. Must have been a few months ago now. Where he I think he scored twice in this game, but the first one he got was he took it on the half turn just outside the edge of the area and just runs forward a little bit with it and then just lashes one in, keeps the shot hard but keeps it low, and he's got that in his locker. The story that I always come back with Scamacca is that the Under-20 World Cup in 2019, he had a goal disallowed in the 100 and something minute of extra time in the semi-final, which was him taking the ball sort of on his chest and then doing sort of an overhead bicycle kick. And it was just incredible show of athleticism for a player of his stature, which then was obviously ruled out. And that was just a complete travesty, but the correct decision, unfortunately. I think Raspadori, who's the complete, he's the inverse. He's the complete opposite. He's very diminutive. He's flighty. He's quick. I think he's been named in the senior squad or the preliminary senior squad. I'm not sure. But if he's also been named in the Under-21 squad, it's anyone's guess which one he'll be in. But he's a one to watch as well at Sassuolo. And there was Andrea Pinamonti, who is another striking, very tall, mobile centre forward, who he plays for Inter, but he had to miss the group stage because of COVID cases in the squad. So him being involved in the knockout squad for Italy is something which I'm looking forward to, because him and Scamacca had a good partnership at the Under-20 World Cup a few years ago. So wondering if that can continue at Under-21 level in the game against Portugal.
Yeah, it certainly should be a good matchup, that. Two very, very good teams, and two teams that could possibly go all the way. But there's no Liverpool players in the tournament. Certainly Liverpool will be keeping an eye on it, and certainly we will over at Blood Red too. I mean, in terms of recruitment, we've gone through a lot of players there. There's a lot more to keep an eye on as well. I always like looking at these young players and sort of seeing who could be the next one to step up. As I said before, Thiago Alcantara was one that I picked out at the Euros probably about 10 years ago would it have been now, when he was.
That's the best one, isn't it?
Yeah, that was that. I mean, to be fair, that was a really obvious one to pick out. He was unbelievable in that. But Ibrahima Konate as well, another story, as certainly as Liverpool will hopefully have concluded a deal for him before that happens. There's loads of players to watch out for. I mean, I know that you think France are probably the favourites to win it, Denmark a dark horse. In terms of a player to watch, just to finish on that, who would your one player to watch from this knockout stage be?
Oh, put me on the spot here. It's very, very interesting, because I would have said Jules Koundé, the French centre-back. Obviously not the French centre-back you want to hear, but because he's just such an excellent reader of the play, but also his dribbles up the pitch are just phenomenal for a player of his position. But I think if I had to pick out one player, I would have said Corey Hakpo for the Netherlands, but he's been named in the senior squad for the Euros. But I'd probably say that I'd go with Scamacca, because if Italy get through against Portugal, then I think it's a key reason because he's done well. If they don't, then it'll be a failing of the team collective, and a reflection of how well coached Portugal are, because they appear to be. I'll go with Scamacca, and not just because he's on the front cover of the Scouted Football Handbook, but he's a player which you can definitely attach yourself to. He's a very striking presence, and if he scores, you can guarantee there'll be some big celebrations.
Yeah, I suppose it largely depends, of course, on who gets through, doesn't it? Because for each of these teams, it could only be one game, and that could be it. But I think that's just about all we've got time for. Thanks a lot, obviously, for yourself, Joe, for jumping on. In terms of tipping for the tournament, players, we've gone through the lots. There's not really any final questions, but thank you very much for jumping on with me.
No, thank you very much for having me on. It's always a pleasure to come and chat on Blood Red. But yeah, cheers for inviting me.
No problem at all, mate. Some brilliant insight as ever, whether it's Leeds, whether it's young players. We know we can always turn to you for that. But just before we go, make sure, of course, to sign up to the Blood Red newsletter in the link in the description. Some exciting news about that coming next week, so make sure you are signed up for that in time. Obviously, leave comments of who you're looking forward to sort of watching in this tournament as well in the YouTube comments box below. And if you're listening as a podcast, make sure you do leave us a review. Those are always appreciated. All of the usual things, but of course, until next time, it's goodbye for now.